The arrival. Emma's breath fogged up the cold autumn air as she approached the imposing gates of Blackwood Academy. Her footsteps crunched on the gravel path, the sound eerily loud in the stillness of the isolated landscape. She stopped in front of the tall, iron gates, looking up at the ivy-covered stone walls of the ancient building. The academy seemed more like a castle from a long-forgotten era than a school. "Wow," Emma muttered under her breath, taking in the Gothic spires, the heavy wooden doors, and the faint scent of damp stone and earth that filled the air. As she stood there, suitcase in hand, a crow cawed from somewhere high above, startling her. Emma took a step back and stared at the crow perched on the gargoyle that jutted out from the highest tower. The bird's black eyes seemed to be watching her, waiting for her to cross the threshold. "Come on, Emma. You can do this," she whispered to herself, gripping the suitcase handle a little tighter. With a deep breath, she approached the gates, which creaked open with a loud, grating sound that made her skin prickle. It felt as though the school was welcoming her, but not in the warm way she had hoped. No, this was something darker, something ominous. The grand entrance hall was dimly lit by old chandeliers that swayed slightly in the drafty air. The stone floor beneath her feet was cold, and the high ceilings made her feel small. Her heart beat faster as she looked around, unsure where to go. She spotted an old wooden desk in the center of the room, and behind it sat a figure in black, Miss Hathaway. Miss Hathaway sat stiffly at her desk, her hands folded neatly in front of her. She was pale, her skin almost translucent under the weak light of the chandelier. Dressed in a black and white nun's outfit, she looked like something out of a painting, a figure frozen in time. Her sharp, angular features gave her an air of authority that immediately made Emma uneasy. "Miss Emma, I presume?" Miss Hathaway's voice was as cold as her appearance. It was more of a statement than a question, as if she already knew everything about Emma. Emma swallowed nervously and nodded. "Yes, that's me." Miss Hathaway's piercing blue eyes seemed to bore into Emma's soul as she studied the young girl. There was a long, uncomfortable silence before Miss Hathaway stood and reached into her desk drawer. She pulled out an old, tarnished brass key, holding it delicately between her fingers as if it were something precious. "This is the key to your room," she said, extending the key toward Emma. Emma reached out to take it, but the moment her fingers brushed against the cold metal, she felt a strange shiver run up her arm. The key was heavy, almost too heavy for its size, and Emma couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to it than just a key. Miss Hathaway didn't smile as she spoke again. "There are rules, Miss Emma. Rules you must follow without question." Emma looked up, her curiosity piqued. "What kind of rules?" Miss Hathaway's expression darkened, and she leaned in slightly, lowering her voice as though what she was about to say wasn't meant to be heard by anyone else. "Never enter the West Wing after dark. Never ask about the students who left. And, most importantly, trust no one. Not even those you think are your friends." Emma blinked, taken aback by the ominous tone in the headmistress's voice. She clutched the key tighter, feeling the weight of it in her hand. "Yes, Miss Hathaway," Emma replied quietly, her heart racing. "I understand." Miss Hathaway straightened up, her cold gaze never leaving Emma. "Good. Now, off you go. Your room is at the end of the east corridor. Dinner is at 6 sharp. Don't be late." Without another word, Miss Hathaway turned and disappeared through a doorway behind the desk, leaving Emma standing there, alone in the vast, empty hall. Later that night, Emma lay in bed, staring up at the ceiling. The room was cold, the only light coming from the small lamp on her bedside table. The walls were bare, and the heavy drapes covering the windows made the room feel claustrophobic. The key Miss Hathaway had given her sat on the nightstand, glinting in the faint light. Emma couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about the school. The rules Miss Hathaway had mentioned echoed in her mind: never enter the West Wing after dark. Never ask about the students who left. Trust no one. She turned over, pulling the covers up to her chin, trying to ignore the strange sensation that someone or something was watching her. Outside, the wind howled, rattling the windows. Then, out of the silence, she heard it, a whisper. Emma. Emma's eyes snapped open. She sat up in bed, her heart pounding in her chest. The room was silent, but the whisper had been so clear. She looked around, her pulse quickening. Emma, the voice came again, soft and insistent, like a breeze carrying the words through the room. Emma's breath caught in her throat. She slowly swung her legs over the side of the bed, her bare feet touching the cold stone floor. She stood and grabbed the flashlight from her nightstand, clicking it on. The beam of light cut through the darkness, but revealed nothing unusual. Then, the whisper again, come to the West Wing. Emma froze. The West Wing. Miss Hathaway had specifically told her never to go there after dark. But the whisper was pulling her, beckoning her to follow. Against her better judgment, Emma found herself moving toward the door, the flashlight trembling in her hand. She opened the door slowly, peering out into the empty hallway. The silence was oppressive, and the only sound was the soft creak of the old floorboards beneath her feet as she walked. The West Wing was unlike any other part of the school. The corridor was lined with old portraits, but unlike the ones in the rest of the academy, these had been defaced. The faces of the students in the paintings were scratched out, leaving behind eerie, faceless figures that seemed to watch Emma as she passed. The air was cold, colder than anywhere else in the school. Emma's breath came out in visible puffs as she walked deeper into the forbidden wing. Her flashlight flickered, casting long shadows on the walls. At the end of the corridor stood a large, rusted door. The symbols carved into the wood were unfamiliar, and as Emma approached, she felt a strange energy emanating from it. She hesitated for a moment, the weight of Miss Hathaway's warning heavy in her mind. Never enter the West Wing after dark. But the whisper came again, louder this time, more urgent. Emma, open the door. With trembling hands, Emma reached for the door handle. It was cold to the touch, and as she turned it, the door creaked open with a loud groan, revealing a dark, empty room beyond. Inside, the room was barren, except for a large, cracked mirror in the center. The air was thick with dust, and the walls were covered in strange, faded symbols that seemed to pulse with an otherworldly energy. Emma stepped cautiously inside, her eyes fixed on the mirror. As she approached, she caught a glimpse of her reflection, only it wasn't quite her. The reflection was warped, twisted, as though the mirror was showing her something different, something darker. Her breath quickened as shadows began to swirl around the room, coiling and uncoiling like living things. The mirror seemed to ripple, and in an instant, Emma's reflection grinned, a cruel, sinister grin that didn't belong to her. Emma gasped and took a step back, her heart racing. But before she could move any further, the door behind her creaked open. She turned sharply to see Miss Hathaway standing in the doorway, her expression calm, almost pleased. "It's time you learned the truth, Emma," Miss Hathaway said softly, stepping into the room. Her eyes gleamed with a strange, unsettling satisfaction. The next morning, Emma stood in front of the cracked mirror again, but this time, something had changed. She stared at her reflection, her eyes hollow, devoid of the fear that once consumed her. Something dark had settled in her gaze, a cold acceptance of what she had become. The girl who had arrived at Blackwood Academy just days ago was gone. In her place stood someone, something else. The whispers that had once frightened her now hummed comfortingly in her mind. Miss Hathaway watched from the doorway, her arms crossed, her lips curling into a satisfied smile. "You see, Emma," Miss Hathaway began, her voice low and deliberate, "this academy is more than just a school. It's a place for the lost, for those whose souls have nowhere else to go. Blackwood doesn't just educate, it consumes. And now, it has consumed you. Emma said nothing, her hand absently touching the key that now hung around her neck like an amulet. The once tarnished brass gleamed brightly, as though it had absorbed the darkness around it. Emma felt its weight, its power. "I understand," Emma finally whispered, her voice soft but steady. Miss Hathaway nodded approvingly. "Good. You belong to Blackwood now. It will never let you go." Weeks passed. Emma became a shadow among the students, moving through the academy's halls with a newfound purpose. She no longer feared the whispers that lingered in the corridors or the eyes that seemed to watch her from the portraits. Instead, she embraced them, knowing they were now part of her. Her classmates, including Lucy, began to notice the change. Emma no longer joined in their conversations, no longer laughed or smiled. She moved with a calm detachment, her gaze distant and cold. "Emma, are you okay?" Lucy asked one evening as they sat in the common room. Emma turned to her, her expression unreadable. "I'm fine," she replied, her voice flat. Lucy hesitated, sensing something was wrong, but she didn't push further. She couldn't know the truth that Emma was no longer the same girl she had befriended. Blackwood had claimed her, and there was no turning back. Late one night, Emma found herself drawn once again to the West Wing. This time, she walked with confidence, her footsteps steady as she navigated the dark corridors. The defaced portraits no longer unnerved her. The shadows that once seemed menacing now felt familiar, like old friends welcoming her back. She reached the large, rusted door at the end of the hall and pushed it open without hesitation. Inside, the cracked mirror awaited her, its surface shimmering with an otherworldly glow. Emma stepped forward, her reflection staring back at her. But this time, she didn't flinch. The twisted, distorted image of herself in the glass grinned, and she smiled back. "Are you ready?" a voice whispered from the darkness. Emma nodded. "Yes." The mirror rippled, and the reflection reached out once more. This time, Emma took the hand offered to her, feeling its cold, spectral touch. As their fingers intertwined, a surge of energy coursed through her, filling her with the power of Blackwood. The academy had claimed her fully now. The following morning, Emma stood at the entrance of the academy, watching as a new student approached. The girl looked nervous, clutching her suitcase much like Emma had on her first day. The wind howled through the courtyard, and the gates creaked open with their familiar, eerie groan. Behind Emma, Miss Hathaway appeared, her cold presence looming over the scene. "You know what to do," Miss Hathaway said softly, her eyes gleaming with satisfaction. Emma nodded. She understood her role now. Blackwood was more than just a school, it was a place that took and transformed. And she was its newest vessel. As the new student stepped hesitantly through the gates, Emma's gaze darkened. The whispers of the academy filled her mind once more, guiding her, molding her. "Welcome to Blackwood," Emma said, her voice steady, a thin smile creeping across her lips. The academy had claimed another soul. And it would never stop. The end.